Welcome to Symbolism, Analogy, and Visual Metaphor in Art-Based Data Visualizations, a presentation that is part of the National Art Education Association's Data Visualization Working Group's Deep Dive session. We hope you will engage with this material in a way that is meaningful for you. We hope you will find time to pause and reflect on how your experiences connect with what we share here, or start a discussion with a colleague about these topics. This presentation may result in more questions than answers, but our goal is to spend time thinking deeply about the role of symbolism, analogy, and metaphor in arts-based data visualizations, and how we can support students in using these to communicate data visually and ethically. We will also make connections to the National Visual and Media Arts Standards and propose ways arts-based data visualization supports student learning in areas of making meaning, communicating, and social and ecological awareness. This is our arts-based data visualization project team. Dr. Joy Bertling serves as the director and principal investigator. Dr. Lynn Hodge is the co-principal investigator. Tabitha and Rita contribute as graduate research assistants, and I serve as the postdoc research associate for the project. During this presentation, we will explore symbolism, analogy, and visual metaphor in arts-based data visualizations, including professional and student-created visualizations. We will connect with visual and media art standards and consider ethical guidance for student arts-based data visualizations. The use of symbols to convey information has a long history. For this presentation, we will examine the use of symbolism to express data in visual imagery. We will focus on the processes professional artists and student artists used to select symbols to express data and create meaning. This artist, Suzanne Brennan Furstenberg, presented over 620,000 white flags on the National Mall, with the purpose of honoring individuals who died from COVID-19. She added flags each day to reflect the continually mounting toll. This was the largest public participatory arts exhibition on the National Mall since presentation of the AIDS quilt. In writing about this, she stated that this art was created, quote, not only to honor each individual whom we have lost, but also to create a moment of pause, a moment of reflection for our nation, end quote. This group of students was inspired by data that documented the different types of microplastics found in the Tennessee River by a scientist who swam the length of the river. Over the 650-mile journey, the scientists documented pollution that was found in the river. Compared with other rivers that have been documented, it was ranked as one of the most polluted in the world. The students symbolized the microplastics with scale, color, and stylization. Rather than replicate the scale of the plastic, they symbolized the scale of the problem by making the plastics larger than proportion than the surrounding river and landscape. They used color to symbolize the different types of plastic and stylized the plastic derived from fabric by creating a braid to replicate weaving, which is shown here in pink. This student artist selected an image of a path near a park to show data about how a local animal resource center has worked with animals over time, and selected images of different dog breeds to represent the categories in the data. One resource this particular animal center has is a program to help families who don't want to surrender their animals, but who need support to care for them. The dog holding a stick symbolizes these animals because a stick in this context connects with the game of fetch or returning an item. While there are no direct mentions of symbols or symbolism within the National Visual and Media Arts Standards, there are several references to meaning. Additionally, the Media Arts Glossary defines meaning as, quote, the formulation of significance and purposefulness in media artworks, end quote. Although we focused on grades 4 through 8, since students in those grades are involved with our research, there are additional mentions of message and meaning in grade levels beyond those that provide plenty of opportunity for students in younger and older grades to connect meaning with data visualization. When selecting standards for each strategy, we selected ones with the strongest ties. However, there are connections to areas for each standard. As an example, the media arts standard referenced above about meaning and message could also apply to how students work with analogy and metaphor in their arts-based data visualizations. Please also note the language in the 5th grade media arts standard about ethics. We will return to this concept later in the presentation. Analogy builds on symbolism to make connections from one context to another, with the idea that you can take a known knowledge about a relationship and make inferences about a new relationship based on what you already know or have experienced. This data visualization by professional artists Mario Clem and Jose Ernesto Rodriguez creates an analogy using balloons to represent carbon emissions. The number of balloons represents the amount of carbon produced by each country. Using the tangible relationship of groupings of balloon helps us make inferences about the abstract and difficult to mentally quantify large amounts of carbon emissions from each country. This student artist created a data visualization comparing traffic citations between selected counties in Tennessee. We can make inferences about the number of traffic citations in each county based on our observation of the relationship between sprinkles and donuts. This group of student artists was inspired to create their data visualization to show the fish consumption advisories due to elevated levels of mercury present in some of the local bodies of water. They placed the symbol of a fish into 3 different environments to communicate the relationship between the environmental conditions and the health of the fish and potential health impacts on people who consume the fish. The middle image, for example, places the fish in a doctor's office to represent the mercury reading associated with fish that should not be consumed by people with medical conditions, while the top image represents the mercury reading associated with fish that should not be consumed by any population. This group of student artists really stretched to create an analogy to communicate the relationship of high E. coli readings and low habitat scores, and low E. coli readings and high habitat scores. E. coli is present in water bodies in part due to fecal matter, and habitat scores relate to the amount of vegetation or movement present in different bodies of water. The students attempted to represent this complicated relationship with the representation of ice cream in a cone and ice cream in a toilet. They were inspired by the popular meme that the ice cream machines are always broken at a certain fast food establishment, and wanted to connect that with the lack of E. coli in streams with good habitat scores, but had difficulty completing the analogy because their symbols didn't quite align with their intended message. We appreciate their ambition to go beyond literal symbolism and recognize that having more time for the project would have likely allowed them to develop their ideas more fully. As we saw with symbolism, there is not a specific mention of analogy within the standards. However, there are concepts in the standards, including interpretation and combining ideas, where using analogy when creating art and data visualizations would be a great approach to aligning with the standards. Visual metaphor provides another format for communicating information and creating meaning. Metaphor has historically been defined as a concrete representation of an abstract concept, such as the phrase, "Life is like a box of chocolates." We would also like to mention the idea of metaphoric context as it relates to data visualization, and note that artists also intentionally place images in settings to create layers of meaning, such as the data visualization you will view in a few slides by Pekka Mitivirta and Timo Aho. This quote comes from a book called Visual Metaphor and Embodiment in Graphic Illness Narratives by Elizabeth L. Raffay. In the text, L. Raffay describes a framework for metaphors and provides examples from various graphic novels about illness. Based on our work with students, we see that this approach also applies to interpreting data visualizations. Students needed to be prompted to think beyond the literal, both when reading and creating data visualizations. Part of the framework Al Raffay presents describes metaphors in categories of pictorial, spatial, and stylistic that differentiate how the meaning emerges in images. One addition we would like to suggest when creating arts-based data visualizations is to separate material from the category of stylistic and place in its own category, because we see the potential for meaning that using different materials has for communicating data. This data visualization we mentioned earlier by Pekka Mitivirta and Timo Aho uses different categories of metaphor. The metaphor takes the abstract concept of the impact that rising sea levels will have and presents this impact in the tangible form as a line of light. Traditionally, light has been used in the context of sea to warn boats about upcoming land. In this case, the artists have used the light to warn the land about the potential impacts of rising sea levels. This data visualization, created by Catherine Clark, visualizes the number of foreclosures in Washington, D.C. neighborhoods. In this visualization, Clark uses the materiality of the quilt as a tangible representation of the abstract concepts such as comfort, warmth, and generational inheritance associated with home. We encourage you to think about associations you have with light in the previous data visualization and quilts in the current data visualization, and how these associations influence the meaning that you perceive from these works. This group of student artists was inspired by the complexity of naturally occurring nitrates found in fruits and nitrates that were found as a result of polluted water sources. They used the imagery of different types of healthy looking fruit to represent fruits grown across different states, but added patches of unnatural color and textures to represent the nitrates that are sometimes hidden that occur as a result of polluted water sources. These unsettling colors and textures reveal what cannot be seen and evoke a sense of questioning and even uneasiness. As we saw when looking at symbolism and analogy, neither the media arts nor visual art standards have a direct mention of metaphor. However, there are places where visual metaphors connect with the standards, particularly in the areas of purpose, meaning, and cultural association. Since using visual metaphor often incorporates tangible representations of abstract concepts, it is helpful to consider how we can encourage students to integrate images and their associations without misused appropriations. The NCCAS Visual Art Glossary defines appropriation as intentional borrowing, copying, and alteration of pre-existing images and concepts. As written, This is a broad statement, and it is helpful to take care in how images are used to construct meaning. We would like to continue today with some questions for consideration. As we saw with some of the student examples, the selection of these elements is related to the clarity and message the viewer receives from created images. What strategies can we use to help students select recognizable images and use image manipulation strategies to communicate layers of meaning? How can we support students in the selection of symbols to create analogies and visual metaphors? How can we avoid perpetuating stereotypes? How can students connect their personal lived experiences with the lived experiences of others? Why is it important to maintain the meaning of numbers when communicating with symbols, analogies, and visual metaphors? Does a more abstract response create the potential for an incorrect representation of the information? And is it possible that a more abstract response can not only communicate the information, but create additional layers of meaning by asking the viewer to engage with an image with multiple approaches? Thank you for joining us for this session. If you would like to join the arts-based data visualization community, please follow the link or QR code to request more information and instructional resources.